Education workers in Ontario are in a contract dispute with the government, and that government is moving to pass a law that would prohibit any strikes. Since that's been found unconstitutional before, they plan to add to the legal language an override known as the notwithstanding clause. Intended to be rarely used, it's a clause that premiers are finding all too comfortable lately. Does it undermine Canada's charter in dangerous ways? Paul Champ is a constitutional and labour lawyer. Thanks for being with us.
Good afternoon, Amanda. Nice to speak with you.
So let's start right there. Most people blissfully don't spend time thinking about our constitutional rights and protections, but they're pretty darn important. And we are seeing this kind of veto power being used by the provinces more and more. Should we be concerned about that?
Yeah, we should be deeply concerned. All Canadians should be deeply concerned about the use of the notwithstanding clause in this circumstance. The notwithstanding clause, Section 33, was put in to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982 because there was some concerns among some premiers at the time that there might be some emergency or something like that where they may need to pass legislation to override a constitutional right in narrow circumstances. And in Canadian political history, it has been used very, very rarely. Quebec used it for some sign laws in the 80s. And then since then, a few other provinces have talked about it, but it's practically not been used at all until more recently. The Ford government and the Legault government have used it a number of times in the last few years. And it's deeply concerning. And now we're seeing it migrate into the labor field.
And of course, the uncertainty it introduces is huge, Paul, because the Constitution is kind of a framework for all kinds of thinking around laws, and that extends right to the business community and what they understand to be the rules of the game. Is there any recourse by the federal government in this to stop the provinces from exercising what might be seen as an abuse of this clause?
Well, there is power in the Constitution as well, under our original 1867 Constitution, a power called disallowance. The federal government can disallow a provincial law, but it's practically never been used, or at least not since the 1930s. We had a premier in Alberta who was, trying to create his own bank and so forth. But since that time, it hasn't been used. And, really, the notwithstanding clause should be that same sort of, only break in case of emergency type of constitutional power. But, what we're seeing with Premier Ford here, it's a bit of constitutional vandalism. And then once he opens the door, if he normalizes it, the concern or the fear is that, it could be used in any kind of context for any Canadian with any right or interest or freedom.
Yes, the darkest vision of this, of course, is that all kinds of rights get trampled. In this case, Paul, it appears when we kind of canvass public opinion that this is this particular issue, and that is the right to strike by educators. There is some sympathy, perhaps, out there in not allowing that and keeping educators at work after everything everybody's gone through. What's the danger in the politics of something playing into our view of how this is used? In other words, can ordinary people separate the legal importance of this being rare and little used from, we wish that people would just do X, Y, or Z?
Well, this is the problem, and is that we have had back to work legislation before. The federal government, the Trudeau government, who's criticizing Premier Ford right now, they've used back to work legislation twice for postal workers and for grain handlers. They've used it twice. But you can order back to work and pass a law and argue that it's justified under Section 1 of the Charter. That's another provision in our Constitution that allows governments to override charter rights in some circumstances. It's just with Section 1, the government has to show that it's reasonable and demonstrably justified in the circumstances. Section 33, the notwithstanding clause, is just like smack, that's it. You can't contest it. So the issue here is that, the Ford government has turned, what is a fairly pedestrian labor dispute, although obviously with, parents and having kids in school is also a serious issue, into, arguably a constitutional crisis. He could order back to work legislation if he wants, but try to defend it under Section 1. And what's worse, he's also imposing a contract on them for 4 years, again, using the notwithstanding clause. That's never been done. And I can guarantee you every single union in the country sat up straight yesterday. And I think he's going to be in for a big fight if he thinks he can get away with it.
Paul, so good to have you. Appreciate your time on this.
Sure. Thank you very much, Amanda.
Paul Champ is a lawyer and principal at Champ & Associates. Time for the takeaway and what full circle looks like. Starting this week in Canada, Netflix subscribers can opt for ads with their streaming and in return pay a lower monthly rate. If that sounds a little like good old-fashioned cable television, that is because it is very much the same model. That would be the model that companies like Netflix help destroy by offering seemingly unlimited content for one flat rate. Where things got a bit dicey for Netflix and other streamers is when they began producing original content rather than just buying rights to existing stuff and reselling it. It's a costly business for Netflix, starting with House of Cards in 2013 and followed by a stream of hits and misses financed by investors, not subscribers. But at some point, investors need to see an actual return on their invested dollar. So Netflix is turning to advertisers and a business model familiar to many industries. Rather than charge customers the real cost of the product, middlemen in the form of advertisers pick up the freight. For years, we were all free riders when it came to news and entertainment. But advertisers lost interest in so-called old media because new media like Netflix and Google and others were attracting all the attention. And why not when their services were so much cheaper? It turns out it may have been cheap because they were operating an unsustainable business practice. That the very businesses that help put traditional media on life support are now returning to the exact model of advertiser support is more than a little galling. You might even think it would catch the eye of people who concern themselves with anti-competitive behavior. My takeaway? By all means, make yourself the product and opt in to advertiser-paid content, but don't miss the real story here. It turns out the old way of doing things may never have changed at all. That's Taking Stock for this week. I'm Amanda Lang. Thanks for being with us.